Pardon me, I don't mean to stare, but I think I know you.
Claire?
Reenie, Tessa Thompson, is on edge when she's out shopping in the upmarket and white districts of New York in the 1920s. Taking a break in a hotel tea room, she's shocked when she's approached by a white woman, and even more shocked to discover that in fact this is her childhood friend Clare, Ruth Neega, who is now passing as white, without her very racist husband knowing anything about it. That inciting incident kicks off this layered and delicate art house drama, which is the debut of director Rebecca Hall, better known as an actor. The title Passing refers most obviously to the race passing that goes on in the film, where Claire is able to masquerade as a white person without even her racist husband knowing about it. And in fact, he actually has a racist nickname for her based purely off his disbelief that she would have any kind of black heritage. Quite quickly, the film starts to interrogate that idea, and there's a long conversation in its opening, really, between these two women about not only the practicalities of passing, but also the ideas and the meaning, the subtext, the politics behind that. But what might surprise you is that that title, which is taken from the book of the same name that is being adapted here, is actually a lot more broad than you might think, and the interpretation of passing within the film also relates to the way that class is depicted there and its intersections with race and also with sexuality as well. So just thinking about class, when we meet Tessa Thompson, she's very much out of place in this very upper class, rich, wealthy, and it has to be said, white environment. And then we see her go back to her home and, you know, it turns out to be this very nice, quite well-appointed middle-class house in Harlem. Her husband is a doctor and she has a live-in maid who is also black. And again, it's interesting to note that this woman who's their maid is not only black, but actually has much darker skin than Tessa Thompson's character in the film. So there's almost this kind of colorism being discussed and reflected in there as well. They're quite well known within the society that's going on in Harlem. And there's lots of conversations too about how white people come into that space. It's interesting that Reenie refers to Claire as a white person in several scenes throughout the film. And I guess that's because Claire has chosen to present herself as that, but it's also a bit of a sparring match, a bit of a barb between the two of them. All of that is thrown into focus in the very interesting scene that kind of pins the movie together, where this dance that the Negro League is putting on, which Reenie has basically organized, is attended by a quite well-known white novelist. And they have this conversation that's very testing and probing, and it's kind of done in this catty literary way, but there are some real feelings underneath there and some real misunderstandings too. And Reenie says to this novelist, "We're all passing as one thing or another." And I think that's a real thesis statement for the film and for its treatment of its central themes. I was impressed by how carefully the filmmakers manage those ideas and stop the conversation from becoming didactic. You know, it feels like an open discussion and interpretation of a multi-layered concept of passing. And at the heart of that is this identity crisis that Reenie is undergoing. And it's really kicked off by this central discovery that her childhood friend is passing as white, but it encompasses all different kinds of identity. The most striking element of that to me was a kind of implied desire between these two women. And it's something that apparently is subtextual in the original novel, and here it feels very deliberate, but again, it stays completely subtextual. Reenie and Claire are both mothers. Sometimes they seem happy with their kids, sometimes they don't. Both of them seem to have fraught relationships with their husbands. In particular, we see quite a lot of Reenie's home life, where she's pretty sexually repressed and doesn't seem to have much desire towards her husband, or at least doesn't want to manifest that. What we do get is lots of long hand touches and lingering looks between these two women, where a lot is said without being said. In that dance, when Claire comes back over to the table where Reenie sat, she stands by her for a moment, and we see from Reenie's point of view just the back of her head, the nape of her neck, and then the camera tracks down her back, down her body. And that seems like a very deliberate playing with this idea that perhaps there's something more between these two women that neither of them are able to express. And so again, we circle back to that idea of passing and the complexity with which we construct our own identities. And that story is told through the craft of the film as well. Hall has a lot of interesting ideas about how to use negative space. She's working with a cinematographer called Edu Grau. I hope I pronounced that correctly. He's a Spanish filmmaker, probably best well known for doing A Single Man. He also shot Suffragette, the Sarah Gavran film. And so framing these characters within this boxy 4:3 square frame, we often get shots where Reenie is sort of very far off to either side of the frame or very much at the bottom of the frame, so you have lots of negative space filling it up. That's a pretty standard way of showing disconnect with a character in terms of framing, but it's very effective, so it's really good to see. What was more interesting to me was the ways in which we saw Reenie's face be obscured. Faces obviously are kind of where identity is expressed, right? It's where we see other personalities. And so to obscure your main character's face at certain points throughout a film is quite a striking decision. Early on in the movie, when we see Reenie in this white district of New York, she's wearing this kind of mesh hat. And so her chin is almost always bowed so that we're looking down. She's not looking at the camera. And so when the camera's looking at her, that means we're looking through that wire mesh. So we often see her eyes through this mesh for that first section of the film. And then actually in this moment where she meets this racist husband of her friend, he raises a glass to toast and it actually obscures her face. He puts it directly in front of her face. And again, later on when she receives a letter from Claire, she's in focus when she picks up the letter, and then she walks away out of focus. And instead of the camera focusing back like it normally would, she's left out of focus for the whole rest of that shot as she walks slowly down the stairs. So these are all different ways in which the filmmakers use cinematography and shot choice to obscure identity, I suppose, to obscure the site of identity, the face. And that really reflects the themes of the film in an interesting way. The film's also in black and white, which reflects the time of the film, where it's set, and there's a nice jazz soundtrack as well, which really matches the kind of feel that they're evoking. This idea of Harlem as a center of like intellectual and artistic activity during that period in New York's history. And that square frame as well, again, brings us to mind of the classics, but also boxes in the characters. So we end up with this slightly claustrophobic feeling, I think, throughout the film. The film was shot with quite soft lenses, so it has that kind of vintage characteristic. And there's also lower resolution being used here. I read it was like not 4K, but 1.7 or 2K or something like that. So again, quite a soft image versus most of what Netflix tends to put out. Now, I've said the film's delicate about 3 or 4 times in this, and by that I mean that it's very still. The camera very rarely moves. There's very little connective tissue between shots. You tend to just jump from one day to another. There's not like establishers and things like that. However, that doesn't mean that it's self-indulgent. If anything, I think it's quite minimalist. And that's good to see. Sometimes when you watch an actor's first film as a director, I feel like it can feel a bit mannered. Like they make these very clear, strong, creative choices to tell the character story directly in a way that can feel arch sometimes. It's like a little bit hard to get away from the hand of the director. And although there are a number of strong style choices in this film, I actually think they add up to a film that's very delicate, that feels like a very light touch. And to be frank, sometimes it feels like a little too light of a touch. If you find it hard to pay attention in films that are very slow, you'll find this a challenging watch because very little happens on the surface of the movie. Almost everything is subtext and stillness. So just know that going in. That's it from me, and thank you for watching. But with a film that's so rich in its political ideas and the way that it looks at our identities and our lives, I'm sure there's going to be some fascinating discussions in the comments. So looking forward to having those with you. Have a good one, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now.